They laughed at him when he entered the room. Hours later, they would realize they had just signed their own fate. No one in that room imagined that this man would change their lives forever. A fine rain fell over San Francisco, as if the city were trying to wash away its own exhaustion. The glass building of Hale Dynamics rose above the low clouds, cold, immaculate, almost arrogant. Inside, on the top floor, the boardroom felt like a stage. A long, polished walnut table, black leather chairs, massive screens on the walls, and harsh, white lighting. Everything in that room existed for one reason: to remind anyone who entered that this was a place of power. Ethan Carter walked in without any fanfare. He was 38 years old, tall, nearly 6'2", and moved with a calm that felt out of place in a room like that. Pale skin. Green eyes marked by faint, dark circles, the kind that come not from late nights of pleasure, but from restless thoughts. His dark brown hair was neatly combed, simple, without the calculated shine of someone desperate to be noticed. He wore a plain gray suit, well-fitted but unremarkable, and a discreet watch on his wrist, the kind no one ever noticed, because on that floor, people only noticed watches that screamed money. He wasn't carrying an expensive leather briefcase. He wasn't followed by assistants. He didn't wear a name badge, just a thin tablet, held casually in one hand. The receptionist had announced his name over the intercom, but inside the room, no one seemed interested enough to care. When Ethan crossed the doorway, the conversation at the table softened. Just a little. Enough for him to hear what he was never meant to hear. On the left side of the table, two executives leaned toward each other, whispering like men commenting on a bad movie. "Is that the consultant?" One of them muttered with a short, amused smile. "I thought they'd send someone bigger." The other replied quietly, laughing under his breath. "Bigger? At least someone who looks like $1 billion. Farther down the table, a woman adjusted her blazer and looked Ethan up and down, as if he were a misplaced detail in an otherwise perfect scene. A man wearing a red tie didn't even bother lifting his eyes from his phone. Ethan noticed everything, and he didn't react. What he carried wasn't shyness. It was control. A control so complete it was almost unsettling, like someone who chooses silence not out of fear, but because he has no need to compete. At the head of the table sat Richard Hale. 52 years old, Richard commanded attention even before he spoke. White, with precisely cut gray hair and an impeccable posture, he looked like a man who had never doubted his place in the world. His eyes were cold, trained never to reveal uncertainty. He wore an expensive suit like a second skin, and even the way he held his pen felt like a threat. In front of him sat a discreet nameplate, though no one in that room needed a reminder of who was in charge. Richard didn't greet Ethan. He didn't ask if he needed anything. He kept talking, pointing at graphs on the screen as if Ethan didn't exist at all. "The proposal is clear," Richard said, his voice firm with the confidence of a man accustomed to obedience. "Numbers. Deadlines, deliverables. We're not here for romance. We're here to close a deal." Across the table, Olivia Reynolds sat upright, her posture composed, but her eyes betrayed tension. Olivia was 34, fair skin, lightly freckled across her nose and cheekbones, like a quiet reminder of summers she no longer had time to enjoy. Her blue eyes were sharp, observant, the kind that noticed what others preferred to ignore. Her dark blonde hair was pulled back into a practical bun, not from lack of vanity, but necessity. She dressed with restrained elegance, a tailored blazer, minimal makeup, nothing excessive. She was the kind of woman who learned early that, in this world, any visible fragility would be used against her. When Ethan entered, Olivia was the only one who truly looked at him. It wasn't attraction. It was evaluation. The look of someone trying to decipher a sentence written in a foreign language. Ethan walked toward the table, and the empty chair near the middle seemed deliberately chosen, placed where he would be seen as little as possible. He pulled the chair back without scraping it, sat down quietly, placed the tablet in front of him with care. He took up no more space than necessary. Richard continued speaking, as if Ethan were invisible. "Our legal team has reviewed every line," Richard said, briefly glancing at Olivia, almost as a warning. "We're ready to sign today." Olivia swallowed. She had reviewed the contract. She knew it well, and she knew there were gray areas, clauses that felt too clever, too dangerous. She opened her mouth to speak, but Richard cut her off. "Olivia, I know you like caution," he said, smiling without warmth. "But caution doesn't close deals. Courage does." A few executives chuckled automatically. Olivia felt heat rise to her face, not from embarrassment, but from restrained anger. She wasn't inexperienced. She had fought to earn her seat at that table, and yet in seconds, she was reduced to the cautious one. She took a steady breath. "Courage doesn't replace responsibility," Olivia replied. "If there's any ambiguity..." Richard raised his hand, like a command. "We're not getting stuck in details," he said. "Final." Olivia tightened her grip on the pen. And that was when she felt Ethan's presence for the first time. Not because he spoke, but because he wasn't afraid of Richard. He was watching. When Richard switched the slide to another section of the contract, Ethan leaned forward ever so slightly, as if recognizing something familiar. His eyes sharpened, but his expression didn't change. Calm, detached. Olivia noticed. That wasn't normal. Most consultants fight to be noticed. They interrupt. They nod loudly. They perform competence. Ethan did none of that. It was as if he were assessing the room, assessing people. Richard finally noticed him, not with respect, but irritation. He pointed his pen toward Ethan without even offering a greeting. "You're Carter, right?" he asked, his voice thick with superiority. Ethan looked up, unbothered. "I am." Richard smiled thinly. "So, Carter, if you were sent here to make sure the other side feels comfortable, tell them everything's fine. We know what we're doing." The executives laughed again, quiet, sharp laughter. Ethan didn't join them. He simply tilted his head, as if memorizing every word. Olivia felt a tight ache in her chest. Not because Ethan looked weak, but because no one deserved to be treated like an object in a room full of adults. And yet, Ethan remained calm, almost unshakable. She spoke softly, careful not to challenge Richard directly. "Mr. Carter, did you have access to the final versions?" Richard shot her a warning glance, but Ethan answered her, not him. "I did," he said, his voice low and steady. "Yes." Just one word? Yet something in the way he said it sent a chill through Olivia. It wasn't submission, it was certainty. She wondered where that certainty came from. Because in that room, certainty was currency, and Ethan seemed rich in it. Richard leaned forward, impatient. "Great. Then we're aligned. Let's sign." Ethan looked at the document on the screen, then at Richard, and for just a second, his green eyes seemed to weigh the man in front of him. Then he spoke, politely, calmly, almost gently. "Before we do you intend to review the operational control clause?" Silence. Instant. Absolute. The room froze, like a machine suddenly deprived of power. Richard narrowed his eyes. "Operational control," he repeated slowly, as if the words themselves were an insult. Olivia's heart raced. She remembered that clause. She had flagged it. Richard had refused to discuss it. Richard forced a smile. "That's already been resolved," he said, glancing around to maintain authority. "There's no need to revisit it." Ethan didn't argue. He didn't insist. He didn't raise his voice. He accepted it. But he accepted it the wrong way. Too calmly. Olivia stared at him. And in that moment, she felt as if she were looking at someone who already knew how the story would end, while everyone else was still fooling themselves with the beginning. The meeting continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. The laughter felt thinner, the confidence weaker, the air heavier. And Olivia, who had always trusted logic, was seized by an uneasy intuition. Ethan wasn't there to assist. He was there to witness. When Richard resumed speaking, louder now, trying to regain control, Ethan remained silent. But his silence felt dangerous, like a match waiting in his pocket, for the right moment to ignite. Olivia thought, almost like a prayer, why would someone so calm be involved in a billion-dollar negotiation? And without realizing it, she understood something frightening. She was no longer just doing her job. She was stepping into something far bigger than a contract. They humiliated him, and he let them. The heavy silence that followed Ethan's remark didn't last long. Richard Hale was not the kind of man who allowed cracks in his authority. He adjusted his tie with a sharp movement, took a measured breath, and reclaimed the room as if slamming a door shut. "Let's stay focused," he said, his voice firm, too firm to sound natural. "We have an agenda to follow." The meeting moved on, but the atmosphere had changed. The relaxed confidence was gone. In its place was tension. And that tension slowly began to turn toward Ethan. An executive across the table, a broad-shouldered man in his mid-40s, fair-skinned with a rigid jaw, raised his hand impatiently. "With all due respect," he said, leaning forward, "those considerations are secondary. We're talking about strategic vision here, not technical details." Ethan had just mentioned a point about governance and decision-making flow. Nothing aggressive, nothing provocative. Still, he was cut off before he could finish. "Exactly." Another executive added without even looking at him. "That can be handled later." Ethan's lips pressed together briefly. Not in visible frustration, but like someone accepting a forced pause. He leaned back in his chair, calmly folded his hands, and waited. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't fight for space. And that silence began to irritate the room more than any sharp response ever could. Richard noticed, and he seized the moment. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Let's be clear," he said. "Mr. Carter is here only as an intermediary, a facilitator, nothing more." Several executives nodded immediately. Others smiled with awkward relief. It was a public judgment, designed to put Ethan in his place. The word only echoed in the room. Olivia felt a tight knot form in her chest. She knew that tone. It was the tone used to diminish someone, to lock them into a role they couldn't escape without seeming arrogant. She shifted in her seat, took a steady breath, and chose to speak. "Excuse me," she said, her voice controlled but firm. Mr. Carter raised a valid point. "The operational control clause is not a detail. It defines—" Richard turned slowly toward her. His gaze was cold. "Olivia," he interrupted, pronouncing her name like a warning. "We're not here to reopen closed discussions." She tried again. "My responsibility is to ensure—" "Your responsibility," Richard cut in, now wearing a tense smile, "is to make sure this contract moves forward. Nothing more?" The room fell silent. Olivia felt her face flush. not from embarrassment, but from the brutal realization that even as legal director H, her voice could still be silenced when it conflicted with power. She looked at Ethan. She expected something: anger, resistance, a reaction of any kind. But Ethan only lowered his head slightly. The gesture was subtle, almost imperceptible. To everyone else, it looked like surrender. One executive leaned toward another and whispered carelessly, "See? I knew he wouldn't push back." The other replied with a crooked smile, "Everyone has a price. Some just don't know how to negotiate." Ethan heard every word. The silence in the room made even whispers sound loud. Still, he didn't move. Because he wasn't accepting the humiliation out of fear. He was choosing it, like someone who lets the tide rise before revealing what's been hidden beneath the surface. Richard, feeling emboldened, continued. "Let's move on," he said, tapping his pen lightly against the table. "Those technical details can be handled elsewhere. Here, we're making a decision." Ethan slowly lifted his eyes, not to challenge, to observe. He noticed the tension in Richard's movements, the way his gaze avoided the screen just a bit too often. He saw the discomfort of two executives flipping through papers they weren't really reading. He saw Olivia gripping her pen so tightly her fingers had turned pale. He was reading the room like a chessboard. Olivia sensed it too. That apparent submission didn't match the man who, minutes earlier, had frozen the entire room with a single question. There was something deeply unsettling about the contradiction. She leaned slightly toward him and whispered, barely moving her lips, "You don't have to accept this." Ethan didn't answer right away. His eyes remained on the projected document. Then, without looking at her, he spoke quietly, almost too calmly for the moment. "Sometimes," he said, "acceptance is the fastest way to reach the end." A chill ran through Olivia. That didn't sound like resignation. It sounded like a warning. Richard spoke again, now with renewed confidence. The confidence of a man who believed he had already won. "If there are no further interruptions," he said, glancing at Ethan, "we'll proceed to the final stage." Ethan nodded slowly. The gesture was simple, but something about it, measured, controlled, almost respectful, made Olivia realize this was no ordinary defeat. It was waiting. The injustice had been done. Public, clear. Witnessed by everyone in that room. And Ethan Carter had allowed it, not because he was weak, but because he understood the weight of every second of silence. As the meeting dragged on, one question refused to leave Olivia's mind, a question that grew heavier with every passing moment. Why would anyone accept such humiliation in silence? And even more frightening, what was he waiting to say? What no one knew was what he had already lost. The meeting ended without applause, without enthusiasm, only with the false sense of control that comes from believing you've won an argument. Ethan left the Hale Dynamics building the same way he had entered, without drawing attention. The elevator descended in silence, the mirrored walls reflecting a man who looked whole on the outside, but who was held together inside by nothing more than discipline. The discipline of not falling apart in public. Outside, the San Francisco night was cold. Wind from the bay cut through his coat, and the city lights felt distant, almost unreal. Ethan walked several blocks before getting into his car. He didn't turn on the radio. He didn't make a single call. He just drove. His apartment was in an older, discreet building, far from the luxury one would expect from someone involved in billion-dollar negotiations. Inside, he set his coat on the back of a chair, loosened his tie, and stood there for a few seconds, staring at nothing. The silence wasn't comforting. It was heavy, full of voices that no longer spoke. He sat down on the couch, ran a hand over his face, and closed his eyes. And then the past came back, not as a gentle memory, but as an impact. Years earlier, that same man had walked into another boardroom, not as a consultant but as a founder, the owner of the idea, the visionary. Back then, Ethan believed in people. He believed hard work and loyalty were enough. He was different then, more open, more confident. His eyes hadn't yet learned how to carry disappointment. He remembered clearly the day everything began to unravel. The room was smaller, less imposing, but filled with ambition. His partners sat around the table, people he trusted, people who had raised glasses with him when the company turned its first real profit. One of them, Mark, avoided his gaze. Another, Daniel, seemed calm in a way that felt forced. Ethan noticed. "Why didn't this contract go through me?" he asked, his voice steady, though confusion crept in. Mark cleared his throat. "We thought it was better to move quickly," he said. "You've been distracted." Distracted, the word still stung. Distracted by what? Ethan pressed. Daniel finally spoke, crossing his arms. By ideas that are no longer aligned with the company's growth. That was when Ethan felt it. Not understanding, yet, but a cold drop in his stomach. A warning his mind tried to ignore. Days later, the final blow came. Documents signed without his knowledge. Votes manipulated. Lawyers involved. Clauses he never imagined would be used against him. Within weeks, Ethan was no longer CEO. Within months, he was nothing. The press showed no mercy. Headlines questioned his competence, suggested mismanagement, invented failures that never existed. No one wanted his side of the story. In the American corporate world, success brings applause, failure brings silence or ridicule. But the deepest loss didn't come from business. It came from home. Ethan remembered the night he tried to explain everything to the woman he loved. Her name was Sarah, light brown hair, an easy smile, eyes that had once felt like safety. That night, they felt distant. "They took everything from me," Ethan said, his voice breaking for the first time. "But I'll prove that." Sarah shook her head slowly. "I can't live on promises," she said, tears gathering but restrained. "I need stability." "This is temporary," he insisted, stepping closer. "I'll rebuild." She stepped back. "I don't know who you are anymore," she whispered. "Maybe I never did." When she walked out the door, with one suitcase and years of shared plans, something broke inside Ethan without making a sound. A quiet fracture, final. That night, alone in the empty apartment, Ethan made a promise. Not aloud, not dramatically, but with the seriousness of someone who finally understands the cost of trust. Never again would he trust blindly. Never again would he confuse good faith with safety. Never again would he allow anyone else to decide his fate. Back in the present, Ethan opened his eyes. The room was dark, lit only by the glow of city lights through the window. He stood, walked to the kitchen, and poured a glass of water. His hands were steady, despite the memories. He was no longer the man who had lost everything. He was the man who survived it. Now seated at the small table, the contract open on his tablet, Ethan stared at the clauses the way one stares at their own past. Each line echoed a question he still hadn't answered, not even for himself. Was this negotiation revenge, or was it redemption? He took a deep breath, closed the file, and stared into the empty space ahead. The answer wouldn't come tonight, but it would come. soon. She sensed something that wasn't in the reports. The night passed slowly for Olivia Reynolds. After the meeting, she couldn't simply go home and forget what had happened. Something lingered in her mind, an unsettling feeling that logic alone couldn't resolve. So when the building grew quiet and the hallways emptied, Olivia stayed behind in her office, seated in front of her computer, reading the contract for the third time. The desk lamp cast soft shadows across the walls. Outside, the city carried on, alive, indifferent. Inside that room, however, Olivia felt something was wrong. Not with the paper itself, but with the story behind it. She scrolled carefully, examining every clause with the precision of someone who knew a single detail could end a career. And then she saw it. A small inconsistency, too subtle to catch on a casual read. A relationship between two clauses that, when combined, changed everything. The kind of structure that didn't come from ordinary legal drafting. It required vision, experience, power. Olivia frowned. "This doesn't make sense," she murmured to herself. Her mind drifted back to the meeting, to Ethan's calm, to the way he had mentioned operational control without hesitation, like someone who already knew where it all led. Her heart began to race. The next morning, Olivia arrived earlier than usual. The building was still waking up when she stepped into the elevator, a thin folder in her hands and questions crowding her thoughts. She wasn't planning a confrontation, not yet. She planned to observe. When Ethan appeared in the hallway, walking with the same unhurried posture as the day before, Olivia felt a subtle jolt. It wasn't anxiety, it was anticipation. He wore a light blue shirt, sleeves neatly fitted, no tie. He looked more tired than the day before, but his eyes remained alert, focused. She took a breath and approached him. "Mr. Carter," she said, keeping her tone professional. Ethan stopped and turned toward her. "You can call me Ethan," he replied politely, without forcing familiarity. She nodded. "Ethan, yesterday you mentioned the operational control clause," she said carefully. "Can you explain exactly what you saw?" He studied her for a moment. There was no surprise in his expression, no judgment, just a quiet assessment. "That depends," he said calmly. "Do you want the official explanation or the real one?" Olivia felt her stomach tighten. "The real one," she replied without hesitation. Ethan gave a slight nod and gestured toward a smaller meeting room down the hall, private, almost forgotten. Inside, the room was simple. An oval table, light-colored chairs, generic paintings of American landscapes on the walls, chosen to provoke no emotion at all. Ethan placed his tablet on the table and moved his finger across the screen with precision. "Clause 23, he began. "On its own, it looks harmless. But when combined with Clause 37, it transfers strategic decision-making without requiring board approval." Olivia's eyes widened. "That's impossible," she said, stepping closer. "That combination would never pass without anyone noticing," Ethan finished quietly. "It does, when everyone is busy trying to win." She fell silent, reading the text again. He was right. Completely right. "You saw that in minutes," Olivia whispered. "Even Richard didn't." She stopped herself. Ethan looked up. "Not even the CEO," he said, without arrogance. "Just stating fact. That was impossible to ignore." "You understand this contract better than anyone in this company," Olivia said, her voice unsteady. "Why?" Ethan held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary. There was something there, a story contained behind an invisible line. Because I've been on the other side, he replied. On the other side of what? She asked. He looked away and closed the tablet. Tables like this, he said simply. Olivia felt a knot form in her chest. It wasn't frustration. It was curiosity mixed with something deeper. Yesterday, she said carefully, when Richard disrespected you, you didn't react. Ethan gave a brief, humorless smile. Reacting isn't always moving forward, he said. Sometimes it just delays the inevitable. She looked at him differently now, not as legal director, but as a woman trying to understand a man. You don't seem like an intermediary, Olivia said. And you don't seem like someone who accepts being diminished. Ethan inhaled slowly, as if weighing what he could allow himself to reveal. Not everything is what it seems, he replied. They stood in silence for a moment. Not the oppressive silence of the boardroom. A quieter one, heavy with unasked questions. Olivia closed the folder slowly. Thank you, she said. You've helped me more than you realize. Ethan nodded. Be careful what you see from now on, he warned. Once you see too much, you can't pretend anymore. A chill ran through her. As Ethan left the room, Olivia remained standing there alone, staring at the open contract. Something inside her had shifted. This was no longer just professional curiosity. It wasn't about clauses anymore. It was about the man who understood them better than anyone else. Who was he? Really? They celebrated too soon. The boardroom filled again, this time with a different energy. Not tension, anticipation. The table was arranged with near-ceremonial precision. Folders aligned, pens placed neatly. Bottles of champagne rested on a silver cart in the corner of the room, still unopened, waiting for a single signal. Richard Hale entered first, confident, moving like a man who already saw his name in tomorrow's headlines. His smile was wide, rehearsed, victorious. He greeted a few executives with firm handshakes and pats on the shoulder, like a general moments before the final triumph. Gentlemen, he announced loudly, this is a great day. Murmurs of agreement followed. A deal of that size meant bonuses, prestige, power. $1 billion changed destinies, and Richard was certain his was secure. Olivia entered shortly after. Her walk was composed, elegant, but her eyes betrayed unease. She held her folder tightly, as if it were an anchor. Instinctively, she searched the room for Ethan. He was already there, seated in the same place as before. Calm posture, neutral expression. He wore a simple dark suit, nothing about it demanding attention. He wasn't talking, he wasn't smiling, he was waiting. When the contracts were passed around the table, the atmosphere became almost celebratory. Finally, said a younger executive, adjusting his tie. This deal will go down in company history. It will, Richard replied, smiling. And it will take us to the next level. Pens began to move across paper, quick signatures, some almost rushed. There was too much confidence in the air. Olivia signed carefully. Before placing pen to paper, she reread the first page, then the last. Her heart raced as she recalled Ethan's explanation, the invisible connections between clauses. Still, she signed. Not because she ignored the risk, but because she understood the game was already in motion. She looked up just as Richard finished signing. He closed his folder decisively and raised his hands. "We have a deal," he declared. Applause erupted. Someone popped the champagne. The sound of the cork echoed like a starting gun. Glasses were handed out. Smiles came easily. "A toast!" Richard exclaimed, raising his glass. "To the future." "To the future," the executives echoed. Olivia lifted her glass, but didn't drink. Her eyes went back to Ethan. He still hadn't signed. The contract lay untouched in front of him. He slowly ran his fingers along the edge of the paper, as if feeling its weight. Every movement was deliberate. Richard noticed. "Mr. Carter," he called, forcing politeness. "We're just waiting on you." The room fell quiet. Ethan picked up the pen. Not hurried. Not hesitant, just calm. He read the first page, then the second. A few executives exchanged impatient glances. Richard frowned. "Everything's in order," Richard said, trying to sound friendly. "We've reviewed it thoroughly." Ethan didn't respond. He kept reading. Olivia's heart pounded. Each second stretched unnaturally long. Finally, Ethan signed. The sound of pen on paper was soft, almost insignificant. And yet, in that moment, something far greater than ink had been sealed. Ethan closed the folder carefully. He stood, unhurried. He didn't take a glass. He didn't join the celebration. Before leaving, he looked around the table, a brief look, but deep. As if memorizing faces, as if recognizing the exact moment of a turning point. Then he spoke. "I hope you've read every clause." The words fell like a blade. Applause died instantly. Glasses froze midair. An uncomfortable silence spread through the room, slow and chilling. Richard let out a short, nervous laugh. "Of course we did," he replied. "That's what lawyers are for." Ethan inclined his head slightly, almost respectfully. "Good," he said. And he walked out. The door closed softly behind him. But the impact was devastating. Olivia remained still. The sentence echoed in her mind, connecting with everything she had discovered the night before, the details no one else had taken seriously. Richard tried to restore the mood. "Come on," he said, raising his glass again. "It's just a formality." But something had shifted. The smiles were no longer confident. The champagne tasted flat. A few executives opened their folders again, scanning pages they had trusted only hours earlier. Olivia looked at the door Ethan had just walked through. She didn't feel relief. She didn't feel fear. She felt a quiet certainty. This celebration was out of time. They had celebrated too soon. And for the first time, Olivia understood clearly. That contract was hiding something far bigger than numbers. What was hidden inside that contract? The mistake had already been made. The celebration ended without real joy. Slowly, the boardroom emptied, and the building returned to its familiar silence. Richard Hale remained in his office longer than usual, staring out through the glass walls as if looking over conquered territory. The contract lay open on his desk, untouched. To Richard, that chapter was already finished, but some stories only begin after the signature. Hours later, as night fully swallowed San Francisco, Richard's phone vibrated. He frowned when he saw the name of the chief financial officer on the screen. "What is it now?" Richard asked impatiently as he answered. On the other end, the voice sounded wrong. Tight. Controlled. "Richard, we need to talk now." "The contract is signed," Richard replied sharply. "If this is about revisions, it can wait until tomorrow." There was a pause. Too short to be normal. "It can't wait," the voice insisted. "We just received a full governance report." Richard exhaled, irritated, and sat down. "Then talk." The words that followed came slowly, as if the man on the other end feared hearing them himself. "Mr. Carter isn't a consultant?" Richard laughed softly. "Of course he isn't," he said sarcastically. "He's just—" The sentence died in his throat. "He's the founder," the CFO continued. The original founder of the company that just signed with us. Silence crashed into the room. What? Richard whispered. And more than that, the voice went on. He's the principal shareholder, always has been. Through private holdings, trusts, indirect stakes, his name never appeared because it never had to. Richard stood abruptly, his chair sliding back. That's impossible, he said, pacing. I would have been informed? No, the CFO replied. Legally, he didn't need to identify himself as the controlling party. The contract gives him absolute authority. The words echoed in the air. Absolute authority. Richard felt the ground drop beneath him. He rushed back to his desk, flipping through the contract with trembling hands. Pages he had barely glanced at before now seemed alive. Clause after clause. Operational control, strategic decisions, appointments, dismissals, all there, all signed away. My God, Richard muttered, sinking into his chair. Across the city, Olivia Reynolds was at home when the email arrived. She had just taken off her shoes, trying to quiet her thoughts, when the alert caught her attention. Governance update. Immediate review required. She opened the file while still standing. As she read, the color drained from her face. Her eyes moved quickly, connecting each detail with terrifying clarity. No, she whispered. She sat down on the couch, laptop resting on her knees, her heart beat too fast to keep pace with her breathing. Ethan Carter, founder, majority shareholder, ultimate controller. Everything made sense now. The calm, the silence, the way he had read the contract as if he had written it himself. Olivia closed her eyes for a moment, remembering his first question in the meeting. The warning disguised as courtesy. The final words before he left the room. I hope you've read every clause. She covered her mouth. My God. Back at the office, Richard threw his phone onto the desk and ran his hands through his gray hair, disheveling it for the first time in years. The man who once dominated every room now looked fragile, exposed. He did this on purpose, Richard muttered. He let us sign. Ethan's calm face flashed through his mind like an accusation. Every laugh, every interruption, every look of contempt came rushing back, now reversed. For the first time in decades, Richard felt something unfamiliar. Fear. Olivia closed her laptop slowly. The initial shock gave way to something else. Not anger, not relief, admiration, mixed with unease. She remembered Ethan's words in the small meeting room. Be careful what you see from now on. She had seen it. And now she understood the weight of his silence. He hadn't defended himself because he never needed to. He had been in control from the very beginning. But that realization raised a question that wouldn't leave her mind. Had he planned everything? Or had destiny simply aligned the pieces? Somewhere in the city, Ethan Carter stood by a quiet window, watching the lights of San Francisco. His phone vibrated beside him, unanswered. His breathing was calm, like a man who had finally reached the moment he had waited for years. But what he would do with that power? No one knew yet. The man who humiliated was now the one begging. Ethan's phone began ringing before sunrise. He stood by the apartment window, watching the city slowly wake, when the device vibrated for the third time in a row. Ethan didn't need to look at the screen to know who it was. Some calls carry desperation in the silence between rings. He answered. We need to talk, Richard Hale said on the other end. His voice no longer carried authority. It was low, controlled. Too controlled. In person. We're already talking, Ethan replied calmly. This isn't a game, Richard insisted. There are things we can adjust. Ethan didn't respond. He ended the call. Hours later, the boardroom was full again, but everything had changed. There was no champagne, no laughter, only tension, lowered eyes, and an oppressive silence that weighed on everyone present. Richard entered quickly. His immaculate suit couldn't hide the pallor of his face or the exhaustion in his eyes. He approached the table as if stepping onto unstable ground. Ethan was already there, seated, calm, hands resting lightly on the table. No urgency, no anger. That calm now felt overwhelming. Let's resolve this like adults, Richard began, forcing a smile. There's been a misunderstanding. No, Ethan said, lifting his eyes slowly. There was a choice. Richard took a breath. You don't have to do this, he said, stepping closer. We can make a deal, a bonus, a strategic position. I can guarantee. Guarantee what? Ethan interrupted quietly. The same system you used to crush anyone you considered beneath you. Richard clenched his fists. Is this personal? He asked, trying to regain control. Because business doesn't work this way. It works exactly this way, Ethan replied. You've just never been on the other side. Richard shifted tactics. The desperation was no longer hidden. You'll destroy your own company, he warned. The press will tear you apart. The market doesn't forgive. Neither do people, Ethan said, especially when they're treated as disposable. Silence filled the room. Olivia watched from the far end of the table, her heart pounding. She had never seen Richard like this. The man who once dominated every space now looked small, reduced by someone who didn't need to raise his voice to command authority. Richard stepped forward again. I can leave quietly, he said, nearly pleading. A clean announcement, a confidentiality agreement. You gain nothing from a scandal. Ethan stood. The simple movement straightened everyone's posture instinctively. He faced Richard directly. You treated people as disposable? Ethan said, his voice clear. You ignored warnings, silenced voices, humiliated those who couldn't defend themselves. Richard opened his mouth, but Ethan continued. Today, he said, pausing just long enough for the words to sink in, you are the disposable one. Richard's face went pale. The board members exchanged quick glances. Reports were already open in front of some. Others avoided Richard's eyes, as if distance itself were a form of survival. The chairman cleared his throat. Richard Hale, he announced firmly. Based on the contractual terms and the information now before us, the board has voted. Richard turned toward them, disbelief in his eyes. You are removed as CEO, the chairman concluded, effective immediately. The words landed like a blow. Richard looked around, searching for support. There was none. No one met his gaze. No hand reached out. This is betrayal, he murmured, his voice breaking. No, Ethan said quietly. It's consequence. Security personnel stepped forward, not aggressively, but decisively. There was no physical struggle, no public outburst, just the silent removal of a man who had believed himself untouchable for years. As Richard was escorted out, employees watched through the glass walls lining the corridors. Murmurs spread. News traveled fast. The fall was public. Olivia felt a mixture of relief and unease. She looked at Ethan, who stood motionless, watching the door close behind Richard. When silence returned to the room, no one spoke. Ethan sat back down, as if nothing extraordinary had happened, like this confrontation had always been part of the path. But one question hung heavy in the air, unspoken yet undeniable. What did Ethan truly want? Power or justice? She fell in love, without knowing who he really was. The boardroom was empty when Olivia finally found the strength to move. Richard's fall still echoed through the corridors, in the employees' glances, in the whispers spreading through the building like smoke. Everything had happened too fast. Too much power, too much truth. She left the building without speaking to anyone. The night air was cold, and the city seemed indifferent to the storm inside her. Olivia walked several blocks, breathing deeply, trying to organize thoughts that refused to slow down. Then she heard footsteps behind her. "Olivia." Ethan's voice was low, restrained. There was no triumph in it, only exhaustion. She turned slowly. The streetlight cast shadows across his face, highlighting eyes that carried no pride, only weight. "You knew," she said without preamble. Her voice wavered slightly. "From the beginning." Ethan nodded. Yes. The silence between them was heavy. Not the silence that brings people closer, but the kind that exposes everything that still hurts. Olivia crossed her arms, instinctively protecting herself. "Did you use me?" she asked at last. The words were direct, but fear flickered in her eyes, fear of the answer. Ethan took a moment before responding. He breathed deeply, choosing not to hide. "I needed to know who you were," he said with brutal honesty. "When you thought I was nobody." The words hit Olivia hard. There was no cynicism, no defense, only truth. "And what did you find?" she asked quietly. Ethan stepped closer but kept a respectful distance. "That you tried to defend me when you had nothing to gain," he said. "That you saw what no one else wanted to see. That you didn't sell yourself." Olivia's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. "You put me in an impossible position," she said. "I trusted you, without knowing who you really were." "I know," Ethan replied, "and I don't expect forgiveness, not yet." She studied him. For the first time, she didn't see the powerful man who now controlled the company. She saw someone wounded, someone who had learned to distrust the world in order to survive. "I've spent years fighting to be heard," Olivia confessed, her voice trembling. "And when I finally thought someone truly saw me, I realized it was all part of a plan." "Not all of it," Ethan said firmly. "What I feel for you wasn't planned." She exhaled slowly. "Do you know how that sounds?" she asked. "Like a risk," he replied. "And I never believed I'd take risks again." Olivia looked away, watching cars pass, lights streaking by, life moving forward as if nothing had changed. When she looked back at him, something inside her had shifted. "I didn't either," she said. "Until now." They walked together for a while in silence, not awkward, but thoughtful. Two adults trying to understand what remained after loss. "I lost someone I loved when everything collapsed," Ethan admitted. "Since then, I thought I'd never trust again." Olivia felt her throat tighten. "I lost myself for a while," she replied, trying to prove I was strong enough to survive in that world. They stopped, facing each other. There was no immediate touch, only closeness, shared vulnerability. "Maybe," Olivia said softly. "We're learning now." Ethan nodded. "Maybe." Their eyes lingered on each other. Pain still lived there, but so did something new, fragile, intense, impossible to ignore. She stepped a little closer, her heart racing. "There's just one thing," Olivia whispered. "I still don't know everything about you." Ethan held her gaze. For the first time, he hesitated. because there was still a secret, one that power, contracts, and Richard's fall had not resolved. A secret that could destroy everything that was beginning to grow between them. He would have to choose between love and control. The days that followed were unusually quiet for a company that had just gone through a very public fall from power. Meetings happened behind closed doors. Lawyers crossed hallways. Employees worked carefully, as if every decision could change everything again. Ethan Carter was now officially in charge. But for the first time in many years, power brought him no sense of victory, only responsibility. Late one afternoon, after a long day, he asked Olivia to meet him in the office that once belonged to Richard. The room still carried traces of its former owner. Dark furniture, a commanding view of the city, an atmosphere of authority that had never been earned, only imposed. Olivia entered with steady steps, though her heart beat faster than she let on. She still didn't know what to expect from Ethan in this new role. "You wanted to see me?" she asked, maintaining her professional tone. Ethan stood near the window. His reflection in the glass showed a man deep in thought, far from the cold strategist many now feared. "Yes," he said, turning toward her. "Please, sit." She did. Ethan walked to the desk and placed a folder in front of her. It wasn't thick, it wasn't heavy, but what it represented carried enormous weight. "I could keep everything," he began calmly. "Total control. Legally, no one could stop me." Olivia felt a tightness in her chest. "And then?" she asked carefully. "Then I'd be repeating the same system that destroyed people before me," he said, "and I didn't come this far to become what I fought against." He opened the folder and turned it toward her. "I want you to take on part of the operational control," he said, looking directly into her eyes. "Real authority, real decisions, not as a favor, not as a gesture." Olivia's eyes widened. "Ethan, you don't have to." "I do," he interrupted gently. "Because trust isn't declared. It's proven." Her hands trembled slightly as she looked at the documents. This wasn't just a promotion, it was an offering. A choice that placed Ethan in a vulnerable position for the first time since he had lost everything years ago. "Why me?" she asked softly. "Because when I was invisible," he replied, "you saw me." Silence filled the room. "You know what this means," Olivia said. "If I accept, nothing will be simple anymore." "I'm not looking for simple," Ethan answered. "I'm looking for something that lasts." She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision. She remembered every time she had been silenced, every meeting where her voice was dismissed, and now this man, who could have everything, was choosing to share, not out of obligation, out of respect. Olivia closed the folder slowly. "You don't want to dominate," she said, clarity settling in. "You want to rebuild." Ethan nodded, almost relieved that she understood. "I already know what it's like to win alone," he said. "I want to learn how to build something with someone." She stood and extended her hand. "Then let's do this the right way," she said. With transparency, with limits, with courage. Ethan took her hand firmly. The contact felt different, not possession but partnership. In that moment, they both knew something irreversible had been decided. But as Olivia left the office, a thought crossed Ethan's mind like a quiet warning. To share power meant to share truths, and there was still one he hadn't told her. One truth that could change everything. This choice would change everything. They learned the hard way. The transformation didn't happen overnight, and maybe that's why it was real. In the weeks that followed, the company began to breathe differently. Doors that had always been closed slowly opened. Meetings stopped being arenas of competition and became spaces for listening. People who had spent years walking with their heads down finally felt seen. Ethan watched it all quietly. He didn't give grand speeches. He didn't seek attention. Instead, he walked the halls, learned names, listened to stories, heard frustrations that had gone unheard for years. One afternoon, a senior employee with weathered hands and nervous eyes stopped him in the corridor. "I just wanted to say, thank you," the man said. "I never thought someone at the top would ask what we needed." Ethan offered a small smile. "I know what it's like not to be heard," he replied. "And I know the damage that causes." Olivia, now holding real authority, led change with both firmness and care. Policies were rewritten. Unjust processes were dismantled. People who had once been ignored were finally invited into decisions that shaped their future. In a company-wide meeting, she spoke clearly, without theatrics. "Here, no one will be diminished, so someone else can feel bigger," she said. "Results matter. But people come first." The applause that followed wasn't polite. It was genuine. At the end of a long day, Ethan and Olivia stood together on the building's terrace, watching the sunset paint San Francisco in shades of gold. The wind was cold, but comfortable. "You've changed," Olivia said, resting her arms on the railing. "I'm learning," Ethan replied. "For a long time, I thought control meant protection." She looked at him softly. "And now I know control without trust is just loneliness." Olivia smiled, feeling the weight of his words. "I hid who I was too," she admitted, out of fear of being seen as weak. Ethan turned toward her. "You were never weak," he said. "You were just surrounded by the wrong people." They stood in silence for a moment, not uncomfortable, not heavy. The silence of two people who no longer needed to prove anything. "No games," Olivia said quietly. "No masks," Ethan replied. They didn't kiss. They didn't need to. What they were building was stronger than impulse. It was choice. Months later, the company was cited as an example of transformation, not just financial, but human. Employees stayed. Ideas flourished. A toxic culture had been replaced by something rare: respect. During a quiet interview, when asked about the unexpected turn his story had taken, Ethan answered simply, "Never underestimate someone by what you see." When the camera turned off, Olivia was waiting for him. "What you didn't say," she teased softly. Ethan took her hand. "That real power isn't in a title," he said. "It's in character." She squeezed his hand. "And that real love," she added, "is born when the truth appears." They learned the hard way. But they learned, and for the first time, they weren't building something perfect. They were building something real,